John, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I'm deeply appreciative, and thank you for raising the Yiddish issue, because I think Schwer zu sein a Yid would probably be the most apt phrase for a discussion about anti-Semitism. Well, again, thank you so much. I deeply appreciate the invitation to come to Melbourne for the Gandel Oration and to share with you my thoughts on the growing, I would say alarmingly so, the growing threat of global anti-Semitism. I'm deeply appreciative to John and Pauline for their generosity and their deep commitment to the Jewish community, to the State of Israel, and to this annual oration, which gives us all the opportunity to think and to learn and to act on issues of deep concern to us as Jews. I'm deeply honored to have been selected to join in the company of some very good friends whom you mentioned, John, in your introduction. Most recently, Rabbi Abraham Cooper and Ambassador John Bolton and Professor Deborah Lipstadt. I was at Brandeis, actually, with Deborah Lipstadt, who have graced this podium in recent years. I want to thank Dvir Abramovich for his friendship and his collegiality. Over the past several years, we in B'nai B'rith and the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation Commission have worked closely on a whole range of issues. Indeed, I always look forward to brainstorming with Dvir, whose wealth of knowledge and keen analytical skills serve us all so well. Now, I'm a child of the 50s and the early 60s. I was raised in the state of New Hampshire, which is in the northeastern corner of the United States, and there were 4 Jewish families in my town and about 25 families within a 40-kilometer radius. In those years, a decade or so after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism in America was of a far different variety than that which we witness and experience today. The issue of Holocaust denial and revisionism had not yet reared its ugly head. The State of Israel was in its youth, but the Arab-Israeli conflict was already in full swing. We had relatives in Israel, and my parents monitored, I can remember the 1956 Suez Crisis very closely. Israel was already experiencing biased treatment at the United Nations in the face of threats from all of its neighbors and from Palestinian Fedayeen, who were the forerunners of today's terrorist organizations. But outside the Middle East and the Arab world, anti-Zionism and the BDS movement were not even evil gleams in the eyes of our enemies and critics in those days. What we did see was a more genteel, if I can use that word in the negative connotation, a more genteel and more garden variety of anti-Semitism. And I want to read a few letters that I found in the B'nai B'rith archive, letters which would illustrate my point. Here's one from the Hotel Winona Park in Winona Park, Minnesota, and the date is March 25th, 1947. And it's a letter to Mr. Nathan Scharf, and it says, "Dear Mr. Scharf, just returned from a business trip and found your letter awaiting me. First, due to restrictions, our hotel has to know whether you are Jewish or not, as Jewish people are not allowed in the hotel. Next, I have to ask you about," and letter writer goes into different questions about deposits and what kind of room and so forth. Here's one from July 10th, 1947, from the Woodland Lodge in Elko, Wisconsin. And it reads, this is a letter to Mrs. R. Uslander, and "Dear Mrs. Uslander, we are returning your check in the amount of $5, for we cannot provide for you at the time requested. After seeing your letter, we note that you are associated in some manner with Camp Maccabee. Perhaps we should advise you that we prefer not to cater to people of the Jewish race." Here's a letter from Marjorie Webster Junior College. This is in Washington, D.C., April 13th, 1961. "Dear applicant, Marjorie Webster Junior College operates on a quota system with respect to the various faiths foreign students, and geographic distribution. We regret to advise you that the quota for students of the Jewish faith has been filled. Therefore, your check for registration fee is enclosed. Your interest in this college, however, is very much appreciated. 9. Dear, and the name of the person is blocked out here, I'm sorry that I must return your application and entrance fee for your daughter's application for 1961. We appreciate your interest in the school, but we have found that it is a wise policy not to accept students of religious faiths different from the majority of the girls here. While we are a non-sectarian school, our resident girls are all members of Christian churches. Past experience has taught us that the Jewish girls find it difficult to fit into our schedules because of different times of church services and religious holidays. Signed, Carolyn Pardue, the headmistress. Well, that's the kind of anti-Semitism that we were experiencing when I was a youngster. In those days, there were quotas for school admissions or private club memberships. There were certain neighborhoods where Jews couldn't buy a house, certain fields like insurance and banking, the auto industry, even advertising in those days, which were inhospitable or closed to Jewish job seekers. Now, in our small town, there were some folks who were raised to believe that all Jews were rich, all Jews cheated, or took advantage of their customers. Jewing somebody down was a phrase in use in many places in our country in those days. And many of those who employed such denigrating terminology had never met a Jew before. Indeed, ours was the first family of Jews that many in our town had ever come in contact with. But we were fortunate. Over time, our best friends, and they became lifelong friends, came from the non-Jewish community. My parents, who owned a small women's clothing store on Main Street, had the respect of their non-Jewish competitors, the local bank president, the school principal, and so many others. My classmates were open-minded, their parents were open-minded, and they were supportive of the tiny Jewish minority in their midst. Let me recount one story to make the point. I attended a brand new junior-senior high school. In the States, that's grades 7 through 12. And I played the trombone in the marching band, which always played at football games. At those games, there is an honored tradition to play marches and fight songs. And in the U.S., our brand of football is played on Friday nights and Saturdays. And that year, Rosh Hashanah occurred on the second Saturday of the football season. Now, at 13, I was fearful of telling the music director that I couldn't play that day. And so I put it off, and I put it off. And, you know, trombones play in the front row, you know, and if I were out, the whole band lineup would need to be changed. Finally, on the Friday afternoon before the game, I ginned up enough courage to tell the teacher that it was my holiday and I couldn't show up. Following that, she told me I would no longer be a member of the band. I was mortified. And I told my closest friend, not Jewish, also in the band, about it. My friend's father, from an old established family in town, proceeded to call the music teacher that afternoon. He told her that on a Jewish holiday there was no way for me to be present, and that it was unfair to punish someone for simply following his religion. On Monday, I was back at band practice. To this day, I've not forgotten that small but powerful lesson of tolerance. I learned, and that's guided me over all the years that I have in Jewish life, that to overcome the challenges to us as Jews, big and small, one always needs allies from outside our community. Well, more than 70 years after World War II, decades after Elie Wiesel, who left us some weeks ago, began devoting his life to ensuring that the world would remember the Holocaust precisely so that its underpinnings would never again be permitted to reemerge, anti-Semitism has again shown its resilience. Recent years have brought new incarnations of one of the world's oldest and most destructive social pathologies, as well as a decline in the antibodies that had contained it to some extent during the post-war period. The Jewish community, at least those members of it who are old enough to remember anti-Semitism's deadliest manifestations, has reacted to this worrisome trend with grim certainty, with exasperation, and with alarm. Clearly, anti-Semitism remains very much alive in the year 2016, and indeed in this century. It has reached its greatest peak since World War II. Anti-Israel invective, the most popular and mainstream expression of anti-Semitic hatred today, is seen particularly overtly in the Arab and Islamic world, in the Middle East, but also in Europe and elsewhere. Anti-Semitic literature and media coverage is a common feature in the Arab and Islamic world, as well as in Western countries with large Arab and Islamic populations. In Europe, these communities have immediate and regular access to Arabic-language cable TV networks like Hezbollah's Al-Manar or Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya, news publications and internet sites, almost all of which offer predictably one-sided, inflammatory coverage of the Arab-Israeli, Israeli-Palestinian crisis. Some of these media outlets, particularly those in the print media, employ primitive Jewish stereotypes in service of their anti-Zionist message, often borrowing images and motifs from Nazi propaganda in medieval Christian Europe so as to evoke the vociferous anti-Semitism of Der Stürmer. Thus, one sees images of Jews as ghoulish, even satanic, caricatures with misshapen noses, festooned with dollar signs or carrying money bags, and of Israelis bearing swastikas or drinking the blood of children. Meanwhile, Arabic editions of Mein Kampf sell briskly, even in some Western capitals. In Iran, the Revolutionary Guard's High Command last year reinforced its position that Israel's destruction was non-negotiable. A few months prior to the announcement of the controversial nuclear framework agreement, the Revolutionary Guards convened a conference, an anti-Israel conference, which also featured some of the world's most prominent anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers. Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei has repeatedly called Israel a cancer and reiterated that Israel will not live another 25 years. Recently, an Iranian organization close to the government sponsored a cartoon contest. You may have read about this. A cartoon contest on the Holocaust. A cartoon contest that is operated to mock and to denigrate the loss of 6 million people. This year, in that contest, there were 150 entries from 50 countries. Now, I have here, and you can't see it, maybe you can because there's a screen behind me. This is the winning entry from this year's conference right here. And if you can see, I'm trying to look up there, you see it's a cash register. And the cash register has 6 million. It's an old style cash register. It has the number 6 million here. And on top is the guard tower from a concentration camp. And the draw says, Shoah business. And then there's a key right here. There's a key to open the cash register. And on that key is written, interestingly, and somebody found this in Israel, it's written B'nai B'rith. The point is not about that. The point is, look at the work that's gone into this cartoon. And there were 150 entries mocking, denying, minimizing the Holocaust. In Egypt and Syria, on the West Bank and in Gaza, anti-Semitic and virulently anti-Israel content abounds in the press. Now, the Egyptian-Israeli relationship has become much closer in the face of the terrorist threat to both countries. The Egyptian government maintains that it has advised journalists and cartoonists to avoid anti-Semitic themes. And there is a new book, in fact, in Egypt, which lauds, in the Egyptian way, it lauds the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. There's a photograph of Begin and Sadat, which is something new. Yet, anti-Semitism is nonetheless still found in both the state-sponsored and the opposition media. And you saw that the other day when the Israeli judoka, who went to shake the hands of the Egyptian judoka, was pushed away by the Egyptian, not physically pushed, but did not want to shake hands. That is the product, since 1979, of 37 years since the peace treaty, and of course before that from 1948, that is the product of a steady diet of anti-Semitism. Syrian school textbooks have long not only contained rabidly anti-Semitic material, they teach children that Zionism is more egregious than Nazism, that Israel's very existence is intolerable, and that the Jewish state must be destroyed. B'nai B'rith published a study of Syrian textbooks 15 years ago. Very little has changed since then, notwithstanding all of the problems in Syria today. The language in these books is similar in other Arab states. And there are many examples of hatred in these books, but I'll quote only this. This is from an 11th grade Syrian high school text. Quote, "The vigorous and long struggle of our Palestinian brethren has exposed the racist nature of Zionism in front of world public opinion. It has exposed this new Nazism, which has brought to perfection Hitler's lessons, amassed malice, and become superior in crime until it has become a model of racist evil." This rhetoric carries over to the United Nations, where the Palestinian representative recently compared Israelis to those putting down the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And the Venezuelan ambassador accused Israel of planning a final solution against the Palestinians, whose numbers, incidentally, have grown many times since Israel came into existence back in 1948. The Pew Research Center findings have shown that almost in all of the Muslim-majority countries that it has surveyed, nearly 90% of respondents openly report being anti-Semitic. Again, not simply anti-Israel or anti-Israeli, but anti-Semitic. This incredibly stark figure speaks for itself. In the West, a contemporary version of Holocaust denial has emerged as Israel's most extreme detractors there, too, claim that Jews are worse than Nazis and that Israel is perpetrating a Holocaust upon the Palestinians. Rhetorical attacks on Israel often feature phrases such as ethnic cleansing, claims that Jews are exploiting the Holocaust to collect reparations money, or that they have used the Holocaust to justify the creation of an apartheid state. This, despite Israel's status as the Middle East's only democracy, a diverse, pluralistic state whose Muslim and Christian populations have continually grown, in contrast with depleted Jewish and Christian minority communities in so much of the Middle East, also serve as troubling examples of the misuse of the Holocaust for political purposes. Professors at two of the United States' most prestigious universities several years ago published a paper that trucked in anti-Semitic stereotypes, claiming in a sweeping manner reminiscent of the protocols of the Elders of Zion that Jews control the universities, the media, and U.S. foreign policy, and at that time blaming the American Jewish community for getting us into the war in Iraq. Indeed, classic anti-Semitism is alive and well. Some 15 years ago, we pressed the government of Romania to remove statues of its wartime strongman, Ion Antonescu, that had been erected in several towns and cities in the country. Antonescu's regime was responsible for carrying out the killing of hundreds of thousands of Jews during the Holocaust. And through meetings and public statements over a period of several years, we succeeded in finally having those statues removed. Not only that, Romania ultimately established a commission to study the Holocaust in that country, which was chaired by Elie Wiesel, and on which I had the privilege to serve. Today, there is in Romania an Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism in Bucharest, and there's a monument to the victims of the Shoah on one of its main avenues. Yet, notwithstanding that success, we're experiencing the same situation in Hungary today, with a Holocaust revisionism that includes the existence of statues of Admiral Miklos Horthy, the wartime leader of that country. And the extreme right-wing Jobbik Party has revived classic anti-Semitism as part of its party platform. We will not relent until we are successful there as well. In the waning days of the Soviet Union, I participated with a delegation visiting Moscow, where we met with officials of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. And during the course of our discussion, one official charged Jews with dual loyalty, an old anti-Semitic charge. To which I asked how he could say that, given the fact that over 500,000 Soviet Jews, including relatives of mine, bravely fought to roll back the Nazis during the war in the Red Army. I'll never forget that moment. There was a pause. The silence seemed like hours, but it was only seconds, when another official at the table corrected his colleague by saying it was true about Jewish service for the motherland. Of course it was true, but it demonstrated the depth to which Jews in the USSR, even at that very late date, were denigrated. 16 years after the outbreak of the Palestinian intifadas, evidence of rising or sustained levels of anti-Semitism continue to manifest themselves around the globe. To take a handful of very recent examples, recently in Belgium, a tennis player told a Jewish competitor, "All of you should have been gassed." Earlier, Belgian elementary school students bullied a Jewish classmate by spraying him with a deodorant while he was showering at school to simulate the Nazi gas chambers. In June, assailants desecrated gravestones at a Jewish cemetery in Manchester, England, leaving the local Jewish population shaken. Also in June, in the Netherlands, a group of students yelled, "Together we'll burn the Jews because Jews burn the best," at a high school graduation in Schindel, a town 70 miles outside of Amsterdam. This March in Paysandú, Uruguay, a man shouting, "Allahu Akbar," stabbed a Jewish businessman to death and injured the victim's son. The murderer told authorities that he killed a Jew following Allah's order. In Rio de Janeiro, in April, swastikas were found on the walls of a Jewish neighborhood. Also earlier this year, in March, in Newton, Massachusetts, a town I know well, very heavily Jewish, students at a Catholic high school chanted, "You killed Jesus," to the predominantly Jewish rival school at an athletic contest. At a basketball game 2 weeks earlier, the words "Burn the Jews" appeared on the bathroom wall at the local middle school. And thank you, John, for raising the issue and bringing back the story of Mrs. Kellum, because when I read this story about what happened at the middle school in Newton, Massachusetts on a bathroom wall, I thought about her, and I thought how far ahead of her time she really was. Students for Justice in Palestine, you may have heard of that group known as SJP, a group that supports the discriminatory anti-Israel boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement, has been posting mock eviction notices on the dormitory room doors of Jewish university students, demanding that they vacate their rooms within 3 days or have their property destroyed. And this is but one of dozens of examples of BDS activity on university campuses around the United States. Even in the largely tolerant United States, where Jews have found great comfort, Jews at less than 2% of the population, in what would surely be a shock to many, remain by far the leading target of faith-based hate crimes. Jews are the leading target of faith-based hate crimes in the United States. On the sidelines of the American presidential campaign, Jewish journalists and Jewish commentators online have been increasingly targeted by white supremacists and other groups on the far right, while those on the far left, but also very much now on what is called the alt-right, have increasingly expressed disdain for Zionism, broadly denigrating and marginalizing anyone seen to be associated with or supportive of Israel. A few weeks ago, a member of Congress, addressing an inflammatory group calling itself the U.S. Committee to End the Israeli Occupation, referred to Israeli settlers as termites. This particular congressman spoke in the tradition of his predecessor, a congresswoman, who charged, not too many weeks ago, that Israel was responsible for the Nice and Munich terrorist attacks. And in June, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen, considered a moderate by many, delivered a speech at the European Parliament in which he falsely asserted, not for the first time, that Israeli rabbis have called for the poisoning of the water resources of the Palestinians, poisoning the water resources, reviving a centuries-old canard against Jews about poisoning the wells in medieval Europe. Now, Abbas, clearly under pressure, subsequently rolled back his remarks, but the damage was already done. Who will ever remember the recall? For sure, the Palestinian and Arab media will be repeating that charge for years to come. In Arabic, Abbas's Fatah movement and the Palestinian Authority, surpassed only in degree by the likes of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, are broadly complicit in relentless, dehumanizing incitement to violence and hatred against Jews and Israelis, whether promoted in official media, in school materials, religious sermonizing, or public ceremonies. In Europe, the continent where the Holocaust occurred, the legacy of that historical period may very likely figure in the cultural and psychological calculus that has produced the burgeoning anti-Jewish and anti-Israel sentiment so pervasive there today, just as the tension between Palestinians and Israelis also certainly contributes to the phenomenon. Add to this combustible mix Europe's longtime historical predilection toward anti-Semitism, which some observers have labeled the cultural virus of Europe. And what results is the ugliness that has tarnished contemporary European society for much of the 50 years since Israel warded off threats of annihilation in the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and which now poses the greatest challenge to the continuity of European Jewish communities since World War II. It has long been a fear of Jewish and other supporters of Israel that the generation of Europeans who grew up either during the Holocaust or in the immediate aftermath would give way to a younger generation for whom the Shoah was merely a distant historical event, its lessons substantially faded, if not forgotten altogether. This helps explain the far too easy embrace of anti-Semitic attitudes, taboo for many years after the war, but not nearly as much today. Also compromised has been the bedrock understanding of the crucial importance and justness of Israel's existence, let alone its self-defense in an impossibly dangerous neighborhood, as some critics of the Jewish state have asserted that Israel's very right to exist can reasonably be questioned. Of course, no other state in the world would ever have its basic right to sovereignty and acceptance challenged, whether on account of specific policies or otherwise. But not Israel. One strategy employed by several European governments to combat hatred, and this is important, has been a ban on Nazi symbols and tropes. In Germany, the swastika and Heil Hitler's salute are both illegal, as is the denial of the Holocaust. But neo-Nazi parties, such as the National Democratic Party, are allowed to publicly air their views as long as they don't hew too closely to the platform of the Third Reich. This structured compromise between Germany's sense of obligation to acknowledge its Nazi-era past while upholding the values of contemporary liberal democracy reflects a policy born out of the country's unique historical and political context. Critics might argue that any suppression of hate speech ultimately leads to a backlash of sorts and only stokes the embers of intolerance. But defenders of Germany's legal framework would argue that it balances essential freedoms against the dangers of extremism left unchecked. Well, now Germany finds itself in a deeply unenviable situation as it admits hundreds of thousands of Middle Eastern refugees, in good part out of mindfulness of that country's 20th century legacy. But these newcomers are arriving from societies where culture is deeply at odds with modern German rejection of anti-Semitism and other key values. Another venue in which the impulse to impose restraints on bigotry is pitted against the imperative to uphold free speech, and that's the internet. Given that the U.S., with its constitutional First Amendment, protects nearly all web content, removing material or shutting down a website through legal channels in Europe or Canada is far from a guarantee that offensive content has been censored permanently. The borderless nature of the internet makes such an effort immensely challenging. Many see prosecution of internet speech in one country as a futile gesture when the speech can reappear on the web almost instantaneously, hosted by an internet service provider in the United States. The realities of the internet are such that with Web 2.0 viral technologies, removing comments or a video or shutting down a website through legal means in one country is far from a guarantee that the website will be shuttered for all time. Certainly in absolute terms, new laws have not stemmed the tide of new websites and social networking sites containing hate speech against Jews and against others. In this kind of environment, counterspeech and education are profoundly important. Children are the most impressionable, susceptible victims of hate speech. Teaching them how to filter the anti-Semitism that they encounter online and teaching them why anti-Semitism is woven from lies and from hate could have a greater impact than any set of laws or technology tools. Also important is the voluntary cooperation of the internet community, ISPs and others, to join in the campaign against hate speech. That may mean enforcement of terms of service to drop offensive content. If more particularly US-based ISPs block hateful content, it would at least be more difficult for haters to gain access through respectable hosts. And in the era of search engines as the primary portals for internet users, cooperation from the Googles of the world is an increasingly important goal. What about the Jewish religion? While the Jewish state has been a preferred target of anti-Semites in the 21st century, the Jewish religion also appears to be becoming increasingly under open assault. A district court in Cologne, Germany in 2012 ruled against the permissibility of circumcision except in cases of medical necessity, prompting some hospitals in nearby Austria and Switzerland to briefly impose moratoria on our fundamental religious right. Hostile rhetoric from the media and politicians in Scandinavia has intensified the stigma against circumcision in that region as well. There was a doctor in the German state of Hesse recently who filed a complaint against a Bavarian-based mohel for performing Brit Milah. The practice of kosher ritual slaughter, or shchita, is now banned in 4 European countries: Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Switzerland. Attempts to lift the prohibition in Switzerland resulted in an anti-Semitic backlash. And during a similar debate in Norway, a parliamentarian declared that if the Jews didn't like the ban, let them go somewhere else. The confluence of a message that again says that Jewish citizens should get out of Europe, along with a message that Jews also do not truly belong in their ancestral homeland, combines with an international arena dominated by a plurality of Arab Islamic states and their allies, within which Israel, the world's only Jewish state, is serially vilified and subjected to unequal treatment. In bodies and agencies across the UN system, Israel, a very small country and the only democracy in the Middle East, is routinely condemned more than any other country, more than Iran, more than North Korea, or Syria, or Zimbabwe, or Sudan, or Venezuela, or Pakistan, and frequently more than all of the other 192 member states of the UN combined. Now, whatever one's ultimate views on the Israeli-Palestinian issue are, and the broad mainstream of the Jewish community does support a two-state solution to the conflict, in which a Palestinian state coexists side by side with Israel as the Jewish state. Yet, the Palestinians are the only people to enjoy a UN International Day of Solidarity, often accompanied by official UN commemorations, featuring a map portraying all of Israel as Palestine. And 2014 was declared a UN International Year of Solidarity with the Palestinians. Palestinian refugees, of all the world's refugees, are the only beneficiaries of a separate, politicized agency recognizing them by name and under different terms. That's UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees. But there's more. There's more. There's the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. That's a UN committee. That's a committee that each year sponsors photo exhibitions and all kinds of other conferences which support the Palestinian narrative. There's the Division for Palestinian Rights at the United Nations, in the Secretariat of the UN. There's an Asian division, there's a North American division, Latin American division, there's a Palestinian division, the only people to have a special division by name in the UN Secretariat. And then there's a special committee to investigate Palestinian Israeli practices in the territories. It goes on, and this is done to the tune of millions of dollars of cost to global taxpayers, to the singular worldwide promotion of Palestinian narratives and political goals, all at Israel's expense. The Palestine Liberation Organization, under Yasser Arafat, was the only terrorist movement to enjoy observer entity status at the UN, beginning as early as 1974. And in 2012, the Palestinians became the first people to be afforded by the UN General Assembly non-member state status even before actually becoming a state through negotiations. By contrast, Israel is the only UN member state excluded from its natural regional group. It belongs in the Asian group, can't be a member because it's kept out by Arab and Islamic member states, and has only recently been granted fuller inclusion in another bloc called the Western European and Others Group. It's also admitted to something called juice cans, not juice cans, but juice cans. That's Australia, Canada, Iceland, Japan, Liechtenstein, Norway, Switzerland, and the United States, which is a coordinating body of non-European Union democratic states. The point here is that Israel is not a member of its own regional group. It can't be because it's denied membership. The UN Human Rights Council, despite efforts to reform its predecessor, which was the Human Rights Commission, through replacement, has as members a number of serial human rights violators. And it maintains a unique agenda item, something called Item 7, on Israel alone. Item 7 is on Israel alone. All other countries are considered, in terms of human rights, under a separate item. There's a special rapporteur focused only on the alleged deeds, the alleged misdeeds of one side, Israel, in this Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A litany of Human Rights Council resolutions, commissions, and reports constantly prejudge and confirm Israel as uniquely guilty of severe violations, excoriating Israel alone and not blatant instigators of perennial conflict such as those in Hamas, who are doctrinally committed to Israel's destruction. Only after it declares Israel guilty, it investigates. That's the UN system. And the results of this cynical political maneuvering are not confined to the walls of the United Nations or even its member governments. Whether through media reportage or the influence felt on civil society organizations active at or looking for guidance to the United Nations, the portrayal of Israel as uniquely and definitively nefarious helps set the tone internationally with regard to supporters of Israel and the Jewish community, certainly seen as tied to Israel. The BDS campaign for economic warfare has both directly and indirectly been strengthened by the ritualistic mistreatment of Israel at the UN, championed by the Palestinians and the bloc of Arab and Muslim states and their friends in the non-aligned movement. A UN Special Rapporteur on Palestinian rights repeatedly endorsed BDS tactics over the diplomacy that the UN itself had previously recognized as the sole path to peace. And this year, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was effectively made into a secretariat for the BDS movement, armed with a blacklist of companies doing business with Israel or seen enabling Israeli activity of which Israel's adversaries and critics disapprove. The effort to equate Israel with apartheid, which previously manifested itself in the notorious 1975 Zionism equals racism resolution and the 2001 Durban Conference on Racism, which singled out the Jewish state alone for implication as racist, makes clear that the dismantling of apartheid South Africa strategy is now being applied to Israel and to the pro-Israel community of which we are all part. So overt is the majority animus, or at least the indifference, at the UN toward not only Israel, but also the fundamental identity and sensibilities of the Jewish people, that the Palestinians since 2011, a so-called member state of UNESCO, even as they protest not yet being a state at all, have pushed through an increasingly audacious and offensive series of UNESCO resolutions that either minimize, question, or completely whitewash the historic Jewish and Christian nature of foremost holy sites, such as the Tomb of the Patriarchs or the Tomb of Rachel, as well as now the Temple Mount and even the Western Wall, co-opting these as exclusively or primarily Islamic sites. The Executive Board of UNESCO, just a few weeks ago, declared that the Temple Mount would be called Haram al-Sharif in UN documents, in UN language. It put Temple Mount in quotation marks, and the Western Wall Plaza is to be referred to as the Al-Burak Plaza. That was only a few weeks ago at the Executive Board meeting of UNESCO. One recent and egregious case in point of the UN system being mobilized against Israel, and by extension against Jews, is a resolution singling out Israel at the recent World Health Assembly of the World Health Organization in Geneva. The measure, which was introduced by Kuwait on behalf of the Arab group and the Palestinians, castigated Israel, singled out Israel, for, quote, physical and procedural barriers to health access in the territories, East Jerusalem, and what it calls the Syrian Golan. The text cited, quote, the prolonged occupation and human rights violations on mental, physical, and environmental health. Now, anyone with even a cursory knowledge of the daily lives of Israelis and Palestinians knows that emergency rooms and hospital wards in Israel treat Palestinians on a daily basis. Indeed, the Israeli organization Save a Child's Heart, which some of you may know about, which performs gratis pediatric cardiac surgery, has treated more than 2,000 Palestinian children since its inception in 1996. If you come into my synagogue, in the lobby of our synagogue, there are 2 easels. And our synagogue supports Save a Child's Heart, and we raise money for an operation. It's $10,000, and we raise it. That's one of the projects in our synagogue. And there's a photograph of the children whose operations we are going to underwrite. If you go in today, there's one for a child from Tanzania, and there's one for a child from the Palestinian territories. And Israel has been treating hundreds of cases of Syrian civilians who have been wounded in the barrel bombings and other carnage of that bloody war in medical facilities in the northern part of Israel. Even knowing that, 107 countries supported this libelous resolution, including 28 European countries. On a continent where blood libels against Jews originated, and on the basis of facts widely known in European capitals, it is both incomprehensible and reprehensible that Israel should be castigated in this manner by European countries. And while the UN and other bodies have over recent years appropriately taken up Holocaust commemoration programming, the same cannot be said of serious attention to and outrage over atrocities against Jewish Israelis today. Whether in the case of thousands of cross-border rockets fired at Israel, at population centers, the near-daily terrorist attacks over the past year against Israeli citizens, or the vile commonplace fanaticism in the region, whether it be Sunni and Shia, nationalist or Islamist, those who say Israel simply shouldn't exist, or that it soon won't exist, the UN is all but explicit in its apathy over violence and hatred against Israel's Jews. You know, there's a running compendium by the UN. It's called UN Response to Acts of Terrorism. And it lists its reaction, the UN's reaction, to acts of violence against civilians globally, from France to Lebanon to Mali to Afghanistan to Egypt to Turkey to Belgium, beyond. And yet it manages not to note even a single one of the indiscriminate, deliberate stabbings, shootings, or car rammings that have afflicted innocent Israelis almost every day over the past 11 months. On the other hand, when Israel seeks to defend itself, the Jewish state is subjected to wild opprobrium not afforded to any other country. And we know from history that the virus of anti-Semitism ultimately brings negative effects reaching far beyond Jews. The obsessive focus on the nation-state of the Jewish people by the world body similarly has negative consequences for citizens of other nations, whose truly urgent human rights concerns simply go unaddressed as a matter of course. Better to spend the time on Israel than to spend time on the real problems that people are enduring throughout the world. As these events transpire around the world, the Israel-diaspora relationship has come into sharper focus recently because of a shift in dynamics. Thanks to its staying power, remarkable development, and increased population share, Israel is, for the first time in 68 years, the senior partner in the Jewish world. Noting the urgent security predicament facing embattled Jewish communities in the diaspora, along with trends of assimilation and educational deficiencies, the Israeli government has put forward now an expensive, ambitious initiative to strengthen Jewish identity in the diaspora. A partnership of the Israeli government and the Jewish Agency for Israel, the effort has enlisted thousands of diaspora Jews in both face-to-face and virtual conversation to devise the most effective programming for boosting Jewish life and Jewish connection to Israel among teens, among college students, and young adults. You may have read this just in the last couple of days. Tens of millions of dollars are going to go into this program, and they're going to start first on the college and university campuses around the world, which is a terrific idea because the BDS, particularly the BDS issue, is growing by leaps and bounds on university campuses. Of particular continuing importance is the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, which has been tested at times over the past year by disagreements between the two governments over the Iran nuclear negotiations and the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. But irrespective of government-to-government relationships, it is the changing ties between Israel and the American Jewish community that form the backdrop of the U.S.-Israel partnership. Through changes of administration and occasional ups and downs, support for Israel in the United States remains a mainstream political value, largely embraced by both parties, as seen during the recent Republican and Democratic national conventions. Grassroots Jewish engagement with Israel, however, has declined over the past 45 years, following a very high mobilization rate after the 1967 war. A 2013 Pew Research Center poll revealed that the younger segment of the millennial generation, the 18 to 29-year-olds, has a weaker sense of attachment to Israel than do older generations, with only 25% of them feeling strongly connected to the Jewish state. And it's almost, I say, easy to understand, but it's understandable. Today, an 18-year-old college freshman may well have parents who are in their 40s, who were born around the time of the Six-Day War, perhaps. In such families, the teenager is 2 generations removed from an understanding of a Jewish world in which Israel never existed, or when footing of the Jewish state was so obviously precarious and so clearly dependent on the United States and American Jewry for support. So for an adolescent today, that 18-year-old with parents who can barely remember, can't remember even the Yom Kippur War or even the Lebanon War in 1982. For an adolescent today, the level of appreciation for Israel's mere existence, let alone its significant accomplishments, but also its remaining challenges, is unlikely to be as great as it is to the parents or the grandparents. And only with greater exposure to Israel can this problem be reversed over time. Birthright has done good work in this regard, changing the Jewish and pro-Israel trajectory of many young diaspora Jews' lives. But many Jewish youths in my country don't receive even a substantial Jewish education, let alone an education in matters related to Israel. For them, the peer pressure they encounter on college campuses to disassociate themselves from Israel and from Zionism can be overwhelming. They come to the university, many of them, unprepared to meet that challenge. They lack the basic informational tools to process and respond to the unnuanced anti-Israel rhetoric that has become so pervasive among their generational peers. In the ostensibly safe environment of campuses as much as anywhere else, anti-Israel dogmas have repeatedly translated into experiences on the part of young Jews that can only be described as anti-Semitic. But it is not only our young people that we must worry about. There's a rising disaffection from Israel among some in our community who are academics, who are political activists on the left, and from some who are in the print and broadcast media. Just a week ago, some of you may have seen this, just a week ago in Haaretz, two historians who specialize in American Jewish history wrote of their disaffection with Israel in an op-ed article that was entitled, "We're American Jewish Historians. This is why we've left Zionism behind." And said one of them in this op-ed piece, quote, "The exponential growth of the far-right political parties and the Haredization of Israel makes it a place that I abhor visiting and to which I will contribute no money, whose products I will not buy, nor will I expend my limited but still to me meaningful clout to support it." Well, as they say in Israel, eze chutzpah. This kind of presumptuous rhetoric at a time when Israel is surrounded on all sides by chaos and uncertainty, with Hezbollah armed to the teeth, Hamas relentless in its desire to kill and kidnap Israelis, Iran, believe me, this nuclear agreement, I'm not going to talk about it tonight, but let me just slip that in here. I have no doubt the Iranians are already on their way to a nuclear weapon. I was in Germany recently, was told by people who know that there were Iranians, you may have read this was public information, that there were Iranians out shopping for dual-use technology once again. So, the air is cleared, so they're out there, and they're going to have a little cash in their pocket, so they're going to be able to go out and buy these implements, these devices that they need. So we're surrounded, Israel's surrounded by all of this. Is Israel strong? Of course it's strong, but look at the neighborhood. Lebanon is a closely held subsidiary of Iran, Inc. Hezbollah operates out of there. It operates in Syria. You have the al-Nusra front near the Golan. On the west, with Egypt in the Sinai, there are terrorist organizations, giving Egypt a problem, giving General Sisi a problem, giving Israel a problem. All around. In Iraq is now under the influence of Iran. And so, these harsh critics of Israel, and those who seek to delegitimize it, need only to cite these academics. It appeared in Haaretz. It didn't appear in the Arab world. It didn't appear someplace else in Europe. They only need to cite these academics and others in our community as the justification for even more pernicious anti-Israel activity. Now, changing demographics in the U.S. may also have a long-term impact on the U.S.-Israel relationship and on the commonness of these kinds of damaging experiences. But it's too early to predict definitively. In the meantime, American Jews need to cultivate relationships with other minority groups, with religious groups, by emphasizing shared values such as civil liberties and education and a shared immigrant experience, but also ties to an ancestral home. Jews can form meaningful ties with other communities that can ultimately help to blunt anti-Semitism. Jewish communities in Europe and elsewhere, right here in Australia, could benefit from a similar strategy, and I know that that's done there, and I know you work very hard, the community works very hard in developing its relationship, both with other minorities and with religious groups. Although our task is made that much greater simply because of the numbers. The Jews of Europe need allies who support the democratic values and human rights principles that are supposed to provide a secure umbrella for Jews and other minorities who too often find themselves under assault because of their identities. And that's an issue. As we look at European Jewry, which really is under siege, we also are looking for allies there, allies in the European Parliament, allies in various governments, allies in the media. They need the friends as well, as we all do, here in Australia and the United States and elsewhere. In the end, the fight against hatred is a paramount ethical obligation. And this obligation remains as strong now as ever before in light of the dramatic surge in anti-Semitism, both on the far left and the far right, across the Middle East, in immigrant communities in the West, and in traditional anti-Semitic groups such as neo-Nazis. It is essential to continue the difficult struggle against anti-Semitism, the distinct and uniquely resilient social illness that gave rise to the Holocaust and that persists in both new and long-standing variations today. Toward this end, there have been some encouraging signs from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, which has taken steps to combat anti-Semitism and the related issues of racism and xenophobia. A series of OSCE conferences, most notably in Berlin in 2004, which John referenced in his introduction of me, and a 10th anniversary gathering in 2014 have focused exclusively or primarily on anti-Semitism and have yielded some positive results. It was therefore of particular note that historic 2004 Berlin Declaration, I was privileged to have been there at that time, which provided a blueprint for combating hate crimes against Jewish individuals and institutions, specifically addressed the growing problem of anti-Semitic attacks being committed by opponents of Israeli policies toward the Palestinians. The Secretary of State, Colin Powell, Secretary of State of the United States, was at that meeting in Berlin in 2004, and he gave a very important speech addressing this issue. The passage in that declaration stating that international developments or political issues, including those in Israel or elsewhere in the Middle East, never justify anti-Semitism, should be a wake-up call to those who try to justify hate crimes with politics. Furthermore, the Berlin Declaration issued a series of recommendations to the governments of Europe, North America, and the former Soviet Union to follow up in combating anti-Semitism, including an exchange of best practices between nations, government support for anti-hate programs, systematic data collection on anti-Semitic acts, assistance in facilitating the prosecution of anti-Semitic crimes, and the promotion of academic exchange and educational programs. In the tradition of the OSCE Berlin Conference, governments everywhere should comply with their moral and legal obligations to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance. Governments must compile comprehensive statistical information relevant to hate-motivated crimes. Too few governments have done so until now. States must adopt and fully enforce domestic legislation aimed at curbing intolerance, as well as implementing effective monitoring procedures, and not turn a blind eye to hate. States must develop Holocaust education programs that underscore the distinct nature of anti-Semitism and link the historic struggle against Nazism to the contemporary battle against anti-Semitism. States need to convene multilateral fora to share best practices and pressure other governments to comply with their own obligations in combating intolerance. And public officials must forcefully denounce and stigmatize anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance, underscoring the principle that political events in the Middle East or elsewhere never justify anti-Semitism, even as they are often used as a fig leaf for it. Finally, and not least important, civil society actors, beginning with faith leaders and institutions, whether Muslim, Christian, or otherwise, must take the initiative to proactively undercut and combat any expression of anti-Semitism in their ranks. Virulent anti-Semitism, both in the Middle East and in Europe, long predated any current territorial or political disputes between Israel and its neighbors. Any suggestion that Israel or Jews bring bigotry upon ourselves is a dangerous and reprehensible canard, a true adding of insult to injury. Further progress in this vein will require a continuation of a collaborative effort of friendly countries and non-governmental organizations in order to provide for the promise of the Berlin Conference to be realized in a positive way. Education ministers and justice ministers, for example, should regularly meet in multilateral fora to develop ongoing forms of cooperation on matters relating to anti-Semitism and hate crimes. And government should actively support the important work of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, called IHRA. It's a consortium of governments which sponsors some form of Holocaust education in their public schools, and recently adopted its own definition of anti-Semitism. And we believe that that definition will be quite helpful in the ongoing battle against the anti-Semites and the extremists that traffic in anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. These landmark documents, the OSCE Berlin Declaration, there's an European Union working definition of anti-Semitism, very similar to what the OSCE has, as well as the new IHRA definition, are important affirmations by international organizations of the serious problem of anti-Semitism in the form of dangerous incitement against Israel and its supporters, real and perceived. These documents should be disseminated as widely as possible to educate public officials, educators, journalists, and others about the current manifestations of anti-Semitism. And as concerns Israel's exploitation as a fig leaf for contemporary anti-Semitism, we would all be well served to heighten popular awareness of the former Soviet refusenik and human rights icon and head of the Jewish Agency, Natan Sharansky's barometer for detecting this practice. He calls them the 3 Ds: demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. Each of us can play a role in combating anti-Semitism through support for organizations that advocate on behalf of our community interests, by communicating with our elected officials up to the highest echelon, by advocating for hate crimes legislation, by monitoring newspapers and websites for anti-Semitic utterances, and by speaking with our neighbors and our colleagues at work about Israel and about pernicious charges against it and against the Jewish people. On university campuses, in church organizations, in the media, many of our most dangerous critics hide behind what they call legitimate criticism of Israel, something we see in the BDS movement and elsewhere. You've heard that. Well, this isn't anti-Semitism. Why can't I criticize Israel? They do that. There's legitimate criticism of Israel. But Israel's the only country that's subject to such legitimate criticism. And it winds up ultimately covering something much worse. One persistent cauldron of pro-BDS activity, for example, has been the Presbyterian Church of the USA, which has pressed for divestment and boycotts. Wherever this occurs, if it's anti-Semitism, it must be called so. In many places, attitudes are changing. A generation ago in the United States, few Jews ran for elective office, preferring instead working behind the scenes as strategic or media advisors. In a celebrated 1974 book by the journalist Stephen Isaacs called Jews in American Politics, some of those interviews inferred that being out front as candidates for office might invite some kind of anti-Semitic backlash. Well, not so today. Today there are 10 Jews serving in the United States Senate out of 100, and there are 19 members in the House of Representatives. And some are representing states with relatively small Jewish populations like Hawaii or Kentucky, Tennessee. So too for the entertainment industry. You've seen this. During Hollywood's golden age, Jewish actors often took on less Jewish-sounding stage names. I still find myself surprised when I Google somebody's name to find out that an actor that they were Jewish. Again, not so today. Many of our favorite Jewish entertainers are using their own names, and few non-Jews think anything of it. Well, before I close, I want to return briefly to my opening comments. To succeed in the battle against the anti-Semites and the perniciousness of the new anti-Semitism, trumpeted through the internet at the speed of a keystroke, with Twitter, Facebook, and other social media placing anti-Semitism within the reach of everyone, anywhere in the world, we need friends and allies in the non-Jewish community to aid us in our efforts. One of these friends, John Bolton, spoke here at the Gandel Oration only a couple of years ago, but there are others. There are strong historical antecedents for such friendship. I often think of the leaders of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church who, in 1943, while their government was an Axis ally of the Nazis, led the way, along with some other courageous public figures and tens of thousands of everyday citizens, in preventing the deportation of nearly 50,000 Bulgarian Jews to the death camps. Together with our allies, and we have them in church groups, among members of our legislative bodies, and among people of goodwill everywhere, we can carry on the battle in our communities and places where we have many Jews, few Jews, or no Jews at all. We cannot flag in our support for Israel or let go unanswered the scurrilous charges against it. As difficult and as daunting a task as it seems always to be, I'm always comforted by our own religious texts, particularly our Haftarot, where no matter the sometimes strong cautionary words of our prophets, however bad it can be, the ending of each Haftarah always ends on an optimistic, upbeat note. The critical lesson we've learned from the experience of those who were made victims during the Holocaust is that indifference to the suffering of others, suffering that begins with scapegoating, progresses to discrimination, and culminates in gross systematic violence, is in itself a crime. Therefore, we must aggressively confront every single form of racial, religious, and ethnic hatred. As fewer firsthand witnesses to the Holocaust remain, the post-Holocaust generations must raise our collective voices on behalf of all groups anywhere in the world who are subjected to persecution or who are threatened by annihilation. 71 years after the Holocaust, and 16 years into a new century and millennium, one simple imperative can serve as a rallying principle: that complacency and passivity in the face of bigotry must never be tolerated. Knowing Australian Jewry as I think I do, I know that you are more than up to the task. I've seen it demonstrated time and again at global gatherings of Jewish leaders, where so much respect is given to your leaders and representatives. We will need each and every one of you if we are to succeed. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you this evening.